Hello, and welcome to Bruegel. I hope we are online. We are online, right? Wonderful. So I'm Jeremy Zetelmeyer. I'm the new director of Bruegel for a grand total of about 3 weeks now, and this is one of the first events and one of the most exciting events that we've had since I joined. Just as a point of information, you know this was supposed to be a hybrid event. We actually had, I think, something like 55 people signed up in person, which is great. We've been missing this for a lot, but unfortunately we did have a COVID case. And so to avoid infecting people, we decided to move the event online. But in any case, we're very glad that you could make the time to be with us. It's a super important topic, transatlantic cooperation, climate and trade policies. I guess what makes this so important is that, climate and trade are both very important and conflictive, difficult in their own right. But the combination of them is particularly interesting and tricky. And, one of the reasons why it is tricky is that we have a variety of policy instruments around that, in part get different billings, different instinctive reactions by the climate community on the one hand, the trade community on the other. So we have, carbon border adjustment, carbon clubs, green decarbonization subsidies, which, may be great for decarbonization, but would have trade effects. We have the difficult subject of government procurement. We have topics related to liberalization of trade in environmental goods and services. We have things like sustainable investment standards. So it's sort of this one area which seems to be a crucible for all kinds of policy instruments, difficult concepts, trade-offs. So we have a perfect panel to discuss this. It's an area where we at Bruegel are doing work, have done work in the past, and we aim to expand. So at this point, let me just hand over to David Kleinmond, who will introduce the panelists and take you through the panel. And again, thanks for being here today with us. David, over to you.
Thank you so much, Jeremy, for your kind introduction. Also from me, a very warm welcome to our speakers and our audience at today's Bruegel event on the topic of scoping the challenges for transatlantic climate and trade cooperation. As Jeremy just said, my name is David Kleinmond. I'm a visiting fellow here on Bruegel working on climate and trade issues, and I'm particularly delighted that Bruegel is hosting this discussion at this very pivotal moment in time. As we all know, the European Union and the United States are advancing major pieces of climate legislation in the shape of the Fit for 55 package and the Inflation Reduction Act. At the same time, the list of agenda items for transatlantic cooperation at the intersection of climate and trade policy seems to be growing ever longer. The German G7 presidency has put forward a proposal for an inclusive international climate club. The European Commission and the USTR officials are embarking on negotiating a global steel and aluminum arrangement addressing carbon intensity in context of transatlantic negotiations over US Section 232 tariffs. And WTO subsidy rules seem to be signaling some trouble for the rollout of EU and US public investments into the transition towards net zero economies. And against this background, there's certainly no shortage of questions and thorny issues that could be discussed today. In the interest of time, however, we are asking our distinguished panelists to focus their remarks on two main important sets of questions. And the first set of questions, which we will address in the first round of remarks today, concerns the scope and potential, if any, for transatlantic cooperation on CBAM legislation on both sides of the Atlantic, as well as the question over the benefits of forming an exclusive transatlantic or an open international climate club. In a second round of remarks, what we want to do is to seek comments from our speakers on the question over whether the European Union and the United States should spearhead an initiative to revise WTO subsidies rules to provide a much needed legal shelter for green subsidies, or alternatively, perhaps negotiate a transatlantic climate peace clause so as to avoid unnecessary tensions stemming from the rollout of climate legislation on both sides. And with that, allow me to turn to introduce our very much star-studded panel, which we are very lucky to be able to convene today. A very warm welcome to Senator Sheldon Whitehouse from Rhode Island, who's a tireless advocate of a meaningful U.S. climate policy agenda and a co-sponsor of a recent CBAM bill involving a carbon tax. Dr. Mohamed Shahim is a member of the European Parliament and the rapporteur for the proposed EU CBAM legislation on behalf of the European Parliament that now goes into the trilogue process. We're very lucky to have Dr. Rebecca Dell, who is not only a renowned expert on industrial decarbonization, but also the director of the industry program of the Climate Works Foundation. And finally, we're lucky to have Dr. Jakob Waxman, who is the European Commission's principal advisor on international relations at the Directorate General for Climate. Again, in the interest of time, I will now turn to open the first round of remarks and our first speaker. Senator Whitehouse, you've been very much a key protagonist in shaping the content of the Inflation Reduction Act that was recently signed into law. Congratulations on that achievement. Does the IRA provide for a useful basis for transatlantic cooperation on CBAM and carbon clubs? Over to you, Senator.
Well, let me first thank Bruegel for hosting this and express my delight in being a member of this terrific panel. The costs associated with climate change are enormous. In the US, IMF has calculated a $660 billion subsidy. And globally, Deloitte, the big corporate consulting firm, has calculated a $220 trillion economic swing between getting climate right and failing on climate. And of course, all the central banks and mortgage companies and insurers are warning about economic crashes. So it makes perfect sense that what works in dealing with climate would be measures that have economic effects and signals. So whether we do a carbon price with a carbon border adjustment in it, or a carbon border adjustment with a carbon price in it, there is just simply no doubt that that is the most effective way to get onto a pathway to safety. And unfortunately, the IRA does not provide much support for that. We are working in the Congress at this point in bipartisan fashion, quietly, on trying to do a carbon border adjustment that both sides can agree to. And in the meantime, trade, as President Trump displayed, is an area where the executive branch has a great deal of constitutional authority and could move with much more alacrity and interest than they have to date. Whether we pursue executive authority or statutory authority or both, what matters, I think, is that everybody gets started having the negotiations and the conversation, because that sends a signal to markets, and it also sends a signal to politicians that they had better get ready. There may be a way to correlate the huge investment that we made through the IRA in the clean energy transition with the EU CBAM, but that's going to take a lot of delicate negotiation and quantification to make it work. Again, many thanks to Bruegel and to the many groups that help support us by working through the analytic details of all of this. And I'll close by saying that the one place where we actually did make some real progress in terms of putting a price on emissions was with regards to methane. And methane is a particularly nasty carbon climate gas. So the fact that we're better positioned on methane, that we actually have a price on methane leakage, puts us, I think, in a position to use methane as a leading indicator of what we can do for carbon dioxide later, and positions us much more strongly as a country in the international negotiations. So that's my 2 cents worth for the morning.
Thank you so much, Senator. And, two key parts. One, what you mentioned in the previous interview already is, the need perhaps for an executive beast mode to actually bring about the much desired carbon tax and a CBAM that provides for an actual adjustment to domestic restrictions. The other one being quantification of non-pricing policies that, perhaps, we may here at Bruegel also have our work cut out for us in seeking to quantify methodologies to quantify such policies for CBAM adjustment. I would like to turn to Dr. Shahim, who has been working in the eye of the hurricane called CBAM legislation for quite some time now, and managed to broker a compromise with the Conservatives in the European Parliament. Congratulations to that. You are now leading Parliament into CBAM negotiations with the Council and the European Commission. Where do you see, this is very much a moving target, of course, but where do you see the challenges and opportunities that this Fit for 55 legislation poses for transatlantic and international cooperation?
Sorry, I have to unmute. Thanks for having me. Thanks for organizing this, Bruegel. And I think it's a very interesting panel. Good to be joining this talk. Let me first say, Senator Whitehouse, when I was, we had some really great conversations in Washington and Arizona. And one of the things you always said was, I think CBAM is not only important at the end for the EU, but also could set an example and maybe push some of our friends all over the world to at least try to follow, or maybe get inspired to do a similar thing. Because I think trade today is not only about the interchange of products. It's also about who do you trade with. I think this is a time where we, I think, are much more aware of that. And what I feel is that the transatlantic relation is improving. For example, when it came to CBAM, in the beginning, I had the idea that it was perceived in the US as a unilateral decision from the EU, although we have never looked at it like that. For us, it's basically the end piece for our climate pricing or carbon pricing. We have the emission trading system, which we are revising at the same time, and we want to create a level playing field. I mean, at some point, we have to make sure that the rules and regulations that our producers are affected by, that this unlevel playing field, you could say, this unfair competition and coming from outside the EU should be rebalanced. And this is, I think, what we're trying to do. This is not a measure against any producer outside the EU. It's just to level it out. But for me, what's really important is that at some point, as Senator Whitehouse is saying, whether you have a carbon price with the CBAM or a CBAM that includes a carbon price, I mean, it could be the first step towards this concept of an international carbon price, which is very important. And if we can agree at least on the principle with our friends in the US, this will cover at least, I'd say, 2/3 of the world economy, which is very important. And I know that in times of crisis, especially this energy crisis, we have to make sure that it will not lead into a financial crisis, and we have to make sure that there's enough fiscal policies to help small and medium enterprises, to help industry to decarbonize. And this is maybe the most important thing of the IRA that I've looked at. I mean, it does come with a lot of, focused investments into decarbonization. And I think it will improve the position. I think the US industry and the EU industry are already quite ahead when it comes to the carbon content of production. And we have to make sure that this advantage gets a payoff at the end of the day, because we need to make sure that this advantage at when there's unfair competition coming from any country in the world, that we create a level playing field. And by vastly, okay, we can have a discussion on subsidies and on the WTO. I can answer that question a bit later. But at the end of the day, these investments need to be not protected, but at least need to make sense in this international supply chain. So I think that is this correlation that Senator Whitehouse is talking about. I really understand it. When it comes to WTO, again, I think we have to make sure that we continue working through the WTO. Again, I love a multilateral world and not a multipolarized world. I think we have to work again together as much as possible, especially seeing what can happen if we do not work together. Which means that we have to look at the rules and see whether they fit the decarbonization of your industry. I mean, WTO was made the rules at an era where we were not investing significantly and subsidizing significantly the decarbonization of our industry. I mean, this is a fact. So we have to see if the investment really goes into decarbonization. At the end of the day, it could also be helpful to all other places in the world. I can give you two examples where this is almost, I mean, the technology for wind in the EU. I think we should thank the Danish government and the Danish people for investing massively in R&D. Of course, other countries were involved as well, but this significantly decreased the cost of wind production, which then can be used also by many other countries in the world. PV, solar panels. Let's thank the 150 billion coming from the German government, where they invested significantly in dropping the price. Okay, the Chinese got the technology and then we know the story. This is something I would prefer to prevent next time for the new technologies. But if we collaborate with the Americans, when it comes to green hydrogen, when it comes to many other technologies that are critical for our industry to decarbonize, at the end of the day, these technologies can also be exported, can also be shared with other countries and will benefit the Paris Agreement as a whole. But in that process, we have to have the rules of the WTO that makes it possible, and we have to make sure we have a level playing field, making sure that the investments make sense and we get rid of unfair competition. This is my first statement. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Şahin. This is very, very helpful. You've outlined many issues. If I may just, throw the metaphorical only virtual hand grenade into the room by mentioning again non-pricing policies. We've had in the European Commission's proposal for the CBAM, we did not have the sort of opportunity or the permission or the granted to importers to credit non-pricing policies, which is, of course, given the lack of the carbon price in the US, very much on the minds of US stakeholders and US politicians. And the European Parliament report going into the CBAM and the trilogue does not seem to allow for doing so either. We are now broadening the scope of the CBAM regulation as proposed by the Parliament to chemicals. Are we, now that it matters more, chemicals being very important for US exports to the EU, are we, is that a major friction? Will that cause major friction between the EU and the US? And how could this be possibly addressed? Like what I would like to perhaps gather.
I understand.
Views from you and the senator on this, if you don't mind.
There are three answers to this question. First of all, if you look at the chemical industry and if you look at the carbon footprint of the chemical industry in the US, it's quite advanced compared to many other competitors that are producing in other places in the world. I would bet if we would do a calculation and a trade effect, that CBAM would actually improve exports coming from the US. Because if we would start really looking at the carbon content globally, they will have an advantage as we will have. And I've been talking to some researchers in that field and the numbers look quite interesting. But let me say something about non-pricing and pricing. I always say it's very complicated to compare apples with oranges. The problem is that if we start doing that, then we are in the discussion of what do we include in the non-pricing effects? Where do we start? Because we also take a lot of non-pricing measures. But the benefit of the non-pricing measures is the carbon content of your product, because that will significantly decrease, which means that you will have a better position towards trading with the EU, even in the case, or actually if there is a case on CBAM, because the cleaner you produce, the better it will be, or the easier it will be to export to the EU. I think that's a very interesting approach. And then we will only look at the, let's say, the carbon content that's still residually in the product. But more important, and this is something I try to discuss, and I think this is something we are trying to do within the, let's say, EU-US aluminium steel agreement or US-EU aluminium and steel agreement. If we can agree on product standards or norms when it comes to these big, heavily traded products, and we can say, okay, this is the approach we have on what we think is acceptable in our economies, and this is the way we calculate the carbon content of those products, I mean, this would be a great first step, because then we will have basically an international agreement on how to account for the carbon content. And then the next step would then be, okay, for the US, it could be then the case that if you produce higher than that standard, you have to pay at the border without an explicit carbon tax domestically. And for the Europeans, it would be, okay, our producers pay for the carbon that they are producing in the EU, and everyone that's exporting to the EU will then also be paying for that part. But if we would agree on these type of standards, that's why I'm quite excited, but it's been taking too much time on this agreement between the EU and US, because that could be a blueprint for many other products and sectors. Because if we would do that in a good way and we would agree on the methodology, I mean, that's a breakthrough when it comes to, I think, international carbon accounting, setting standards, and that would really significantly help the decarbonization of not only the US, not only the EU industry, but I think globally.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shaheen Mohammed. That's really a great answer to the concerns that are being raised in the United States on non-pricing policies and crediting thereof. Senator Whitehouse, may I gather a view from you on this? Is the US side, is the US administration and US stakeholders, are they right in demanding that non-pricing policies should be credited to CBAM, to an EU CBAM, or is this perhaps more of a political stun grenade? What do you have a view?
Well, I think it's a conversation that needs to take place. I think at the end of the day, there needs to be integrity in the trade process and in how these things are calculated. If that basic proposition is not met, if this is just sort of horse trading and power and who can get away with what, then I think we've set a terrible precedent for the future. So I think I don't want to rule out that there is a good way to take what we've done. It's $1/3 of $1 trillion. It's actually a big deal, and find a way for the EU to be willing to give us some credit for it in the CBAM. But I'm not in the weeds enough to be able to say how that should take place. Just that it should take place, and it should be driven by real analytical integrity. And if that integrity isn't there, then there should not be a credit for it. I do think if it's happening in the context of ongoing live public discussions and negotiations preparatory to a carbon club or international carbon border adjustment, that actually helps the conversation go forward. And as I said before, I think methane actually gives us a platform to do this now, with methane as kind of the leading indicator and model for a carbon regulation that could come right behind it based on the methane model. Because we do meet, I think, the standards that Minister Shaheen is suggesting with our methane model in this case.
Thank you. That's wonderful. You mentioned really the historical achievement of having a first greenhouse gas tax in the United States, if I see this correctly, on the federal level, which is.
We prefer to call it a price. but that's okay.
Let's call it the price. Fair enough.
David, this point on integrity is very important because I think there are some discussions on how to calculate. And I always use, I think people that followed me for the last 3 years have seen that I'm trying to get a bit more in shape. I'm preparing for a marathon. And I always tell them, at the end of the day, if I try to measure my weight and if I only put 1 foot on the scale, the numbers look really good, but they don't reflect reality. So it's very important that this system of calculating the embedded emissions are done in the right way, and we should not greenwash that methodology. So integrity, I think Mr. Senator Whitehouse has a very important point that needs to be undisputable, which then means we can really set a standard worldwide.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shahim. You mentioned greenwashing, which gives us, and the necessity to really have solid methodologies on carbon accounting to set common standards that could apply not only domestically but also at the border, instead of applying tariffs or charges. That could be an alternative. Now we have, the negotiation of the global steel and aluminum arrangement between the transatlantic partners, which is, we don't know what's going to come out of that. But as you said earlier, that could be one of the vehicles towards the achievement of that objective, or could perhaps be broadened to a wider group of nations and countries to be more inclusive. I would like to turn to Dr. Dell. Dr. Dell, thank you very much in the first place for calling in from San Francisco this morning. I think it's about 6 o'clock in the morning there, in such an early hour. In light of all of your work towards shaping the content of US climate legislations, congratulations to you too for the important achievement of the IRA. In your view, given what we've heard now from the two lawmakers as well, what's your view on the opportunities and challenges deriving from the IRA and Fit for 55 for CBAM and Climate Club Corporation? Thank you.
Oh, thanks so much for having me, David. I'm very pleased to be on this very distinguished panel. So I suppose I come at this issue from a slightly different perspective than some of the fellow panelists, which is to say that I'm not a trade expert. My expertise is in how we decarbonize heavy industry, how we produce the commodities that we need in a way that doesn't bake the planet. And so my entry into trade is in thinking about how can trade support that goal, or at least not undermine it, understanding that most of the really muscular policy in this space is going to be domestic or regional. So I have 3 comments that I would like to make about today's topics, and all of them reflect the sectoral concentration of the greenhouse gases in the industrial sector. This is kind of the basic fact here, which is that there's the industrial sector is responsible for between 1/4 and 1/3 of all greenhouse gas emissions. And those emissions are overwhelmingly dominated by a very small number of industries, which are all basic materials industries. So 3/4 of those emissions come from steel, cement, plastic, fertilizer, aluminum, and other basic materials. And so the thing about these materials is that producing them tends to be relatively low value added. And so they don't show up in a big way in GDP or trade numbers, but they are foundational to the rest of the economy. If you don't have access to them, it's like it's like not having access to energy. You can't run the rest of your economy. And so the 3 kind of comments I'd like to make have to do with cost, security, and uncertainty. On the cost point, I think we should recognize that while there are certainly differences in the current CO2 intensity of these products internationally, and the transatlantic world tends to show up pretty favorably in those numbers, those are incremental differences, reflecting structural factors in the industries and the energy sources they use. And the fact of the matter is that really low carbon production in all of these industries remains a pre-commercial technology, or relies on pre-commercial technologies. And so bringing those technologies and the business systems that support them to commercial readiness and deployment is going to cost more than incumbent modes of production. And also, there's a good chance that even after we've brought clean production to scale, it will continue to cost more than dirty production in perpetuity. There's a good chance that we will never achieve the feat that we have in wind or solar, that they have become cheaper than dirty energy, that will never happen in the steel industry or the cement industry or the chemicals industry. And so we're going to need very strong policies to achieve that commercialization in the short term, and then to condition markets to make clean production favorable in the long term. And particularly for that short-term task where innovation is an important part of it, a carbon price doesn't really get us where we want to go, because the carbon price would have to be so high that it just wouldn't make sense for the rest of the economy. And so the kind of direct subsidies that you see in the IRA and in the EU Innovation Fund and in other policy mechanisms, those are going to be necessary for years to come. So that's the issue of cost. Then I'll make more brief comments on two other issues. The second is security. Like I said, these are fundamental materials. And so national decision-making about their production is often as much about security and economic resilience as it is about GDP. There are currently 29 integrated steel mills in Europe, and almost every country has either one or two of them. That's not because that is the economically optimal way to produce steel. It's because every country wants one steel mill. And so there are going to be a lot of restraints of trade associated with these industries. And that's just how it's going to have to be forever, because there are issues at stake that are kind of more fundamental than just economic efficiency. And then the last thing I want to comment on is the issue of uncertainty. It's relatively straightforward to tell how much greenhouse gas is being emitted by a facility. It actually becomes quite difficult to map from a facility to the products that facility makes if there's more than one product being made. And once the products leave the facility, it becomes extremely difficult to have a reliable attribution of greenhouse gases to products. And when those products leave the country, it becomes nearly impossible, particularly if you have a muscular policy, which is another way of saying people have an incentive to try and cheat the policy. And so being able to actually enforce allocations of CO2 intensity specific to particular products that are moving internationally is going to be very, very hard. We probably are not going to be able to do it in the way that we want to. And the issue of enforcement should be a top tier issue when designing these policies. Can we actually enforce the policy that we are defining if people are trying to cheat? Because people will try to cheat. And so the consequences of all of these things are that kind of first best solutions, particularly as defined by economic efficiency, are almost certainly unavailable to us. We're almost certainly going to have to content ourselves with some kind of rough, crude substitutes that do not optimize the incentives, and so should be designed with the we should acknowledge that we're constrained to this kind of messy world and design policies that can maintain incentives in spite of that.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. That is very much what we were hoping to hear from you and others as well, bringing the US perspective on the IRA into this conversation. And may I ask you a follow-up question, or perhaps like comment on this in the way that here at Bruegel we of course we're looking at economic policy and looking at we look at efficiency, promoting positive externalities through subsidies is widely acknowledged to be indispensable and essential in the rollout of climate policies. But of course, we also have those subsidies where we are really which could be perhaps attributed to governance failure and simply trying to get the votes in Congress that are necessary. Are the domestic content requirements in the IRA part of that necessary evil? Perhaps you want to say a word on that, or we can turn to this like in the subsidy round of conversation as you wish.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think that, part of the kind of messy world that I'm describing and part of the need for high value early markets for clean products, both of those things kind of align to make public procurement incentives a great way to facilitate progress, particularly in the commodities that are bought in very, very large quantities by governments, which are building materials. Mm-hmm. Steel and cement, the two highest emitting industries. And so from an American perspective, we're trying to get these low carbon technologies commercialized. We have a very large domestic market. And so almost all of these materials are going to be sourced domestically regardless. And the domestic content requirements, I think, are helpful in securing the kind of robustness of those high value lead markets. However, I'm very clear about the fact that if you are from a smaller country than the United States that does not have the privilege of such a large internal market, the calculation would look very, very different. And so how we negotiate between those two perspectives is, kind of why we need to have conversations like the one today.
Indeed. As we are talking about domestic content requirements, and we go back and forth a little bit along a conversational flexibility here, invoking that principle. Perhaps Senator Whitehouse has a view on domestic content requirements in the IRA, which are the IRA is full of them, and whether this is actually helpful or perhaps stands in the way of a fast rollout of say EVs. We got a question from Andy Bounds from the Financial Times, who asks that, or points out that Bruno Le Maire suggested that the EU should follow the US in restricting subsidies for EVs to those made in the EU only. What is the panel's view on this? That is a big one. Is somewhat inflammatory these days, this particular subject matter, as we see investments decisions being made in favor of US production recently. So if there are any views on from the senator or from you, Rebecca, that from the US perspective on this particular subject matter, that would be wonderful. I would also want to point out at this point, I've been reminded by our communications team that we have a section on the event website where we can pose questions, where we can enter questions on the Slido app, on the Slido website. So please, if you have questions from the audience, please enter them on the event website and send them to us. We'll be very grateful. But if you have any... Yes.
I won't get into any of the details because those are probably going to be litigated out in the public and in the WTO in the future. But I would say a few things. One, the US has absolutely set the standard for importing stuff. Our trade deficit is a pretty strong measure that we've been extraordinarily generous in terms of foreign content in products. Second, the recent post-COVID episode shows that there is a national security component here, not only to the climate aspect of this, but to the supply chain reliability aspect of this. And particularly if you were to put us up against the Chinese and look at their intellectual property theft, their currency manipulation, their massive government subsidies to government-owned countries, we have nothing to be ashamed of.
That is wonderful to hear. Thank you so much, Senator. There is, of course, the benefits to imports as well, but you know, that is perhaps another discussion. I would like to turn to Dr. Werkmans at this point, who is the principal advisor at DG Klima for the international dimension of EU climate policy, not directly responsible for the EU for CBAM legislation, but who will certainly have one or two views on what was previously said, but also on the potential of Fit for 55 and the IRA for CBAM cooperation, and as well as the Carbon Club proposal that has come out on the German G7 presidency.
Thanks a lot, David, and thanks for the opportunity to join the panel with such champions of progressive climate legislation and colleagues that have been looking at these issues in a way that much deeper than I've been able to from my own perspective. I do spend most of my time on the Paris Agreement negotiations, but clearly the close cooperation between the EU and the United States has been key to pushing forward many important aspects of the international politics as well. So when we saw the IRA, our first instinct, of course, was to welcome it. It's been a long time coming to see a major piece of climate legislation come out of the United States. And with the ambitious targets set by the Biden administration in the Paris Agreement, we were eager to see more detail on how the US generally, but Congress in particular, was going to provide support in terms of its implementation. The sheer scale of the resources, there's already been mentioned, of course, we're welcoming that size of investment in the green transition is absolutely welcomed on this side of the Atlantic as well. And the particular bets that are being made with that scale of resources are very familiar to the EU as being key to the transition. Renewable energy, energy efficiency, zero emissions vehicles, green hydrogen, methane that was just mentioned, but also the just transition elements of the bill certainly resonated with efforts that we've been making here in the EU. The modeled outcomes that are expected in terms of greenhouse gas emissions reductions were also impressive and reassuring. We haven't done our own modeling, but there's been a lot of independent analysis out there that shows that the US would be more on track towards its Paris Agreement goal than it currently is, and some have even said that it might put that at least 52% emissions reduction from 2005 levels by 2030 within reach. We're a little bit surprised that incentives alone, that spending alone could get you there, but we also see within the bill the promise and the potential for future regulation. Senator Whitehouse mentioned the possibility that this bill could be followed by another addressing taxes and adjustment at the border. But we also saw the amendments to the Clean Air Act, which for the first time include greenhouse gas emissions as pollutants within that legislation, which was very welcome. And we also understand that the investments that the subsidies and tax rebates will enable could also make the best technologies more available and available at lower cost in such a way that would make future regulation more defensible in court, for example. And so all of that is good news. And we certainly hope that we'll see more good news in terms of additional action that will support the implementation of the IRA. However, we also have some concerns. Again, haven't read all the details of what is, I think, is it 700 or 800 or 900 pages of legislation, many of which is very complex amendments to existing legislation. But I think it's important that we flag out some concerns as well. You just flagged one of them, that a very substantial chunk of the incentives provided through the Act are tied to domestic content requirements. And from the perspective of someone who looks at international relations as they relate to climate change, including trade, this appears to us to be a prima facie violation of either the national treatment provisions or the MFN obligations in the WTO, or in some circumstances, both. Unlike our rollout of the CBAM, which also raised some trade concerns, we haven't heard any effort to justify any of these measures within the IRA as being WTO compatible. And so while there may be other justifications for them, we haven't yet heard that line of argumentation, and don't see any direct environmental benefits to the inclusion of domestic content requirements that one would normally have to demonstrate in the context of a WTO dispute. So while we understand that these additional pieces may have been essential to achieving the art of what was politically possible, I think we still have some concerns and are hoping to find a way forward to deeper cooperation that can help to address these concerns. But I think there is also the potential to identify areas where the IRA can lead to deeper cooperation in, as others have mentioned, the idea of harmonizing product or process related standards. Again, haven't been through the Act in as much detail as I should have, but for example, you can discover that in addition to domestic content requirements, there are requirements to meet certain standards. For example, to subsidize the production of what's called clean hydrogen within the IRA. My guess is that with a deeper look, we'll surface other similar kinds of standards that could be the basis for closer conversations, for example, under the Trade and Technology Council that was set up early on in the relationship between the Biden administration and the EU, and that this should lead to deeper and broader transatlantic cooperation, as well as begin to see in what areas harmonized standards could help in terms of increasing supply chains and reducing any trade frictions. It's true that the Climate Club, as originally conceived, would provide potentially a forum for broadening out that transatlantic cooperation to cooperation with other major economies as well, and we certainly would look forward to that also. One last comment that moves from the transatlantic to the plurilateral to the multilateral, getting back to the Paris Agreement. I think that the fact that the US has been able to come forward with the IRA now will be very helpful in many ways to the politics at COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, because this is a COP that is dedicated to implementation and to showing that countries and parties haven't just made pledges and set targets for themselves, but they're actually carrying out the domestic policies necessary to achieve those. We will have made very significant progress, thanks to our colleagues in the Parliament and the Council, towards completing our Fit for 55 package, and the IRA certainly will provide a strong narrative for the US to show that they're taking their pledges seriously also. But I think we have to be careful that we not send the wrong kinds of messages in terms of the IRA on its own being a model. Because there is a limited applicability, and I think Dr. Dell's comments pointed to this, of this kind of approach of spending your way towards net zero to other and particularly developing country parties that don't have a lot of fiscal headroom at the moment and don't have the same ability to generate billions to invest in their own economies. So while yes, subsidies are going to be key to transforming the economy, we can't expect all parties to follow that. And we really have to send messages that this is only part of the story, and it will be followed by acts like carbon pricing and other kinds of regulation if we're really going to set an example for the way other countries should act as well. And then finally, I think it's important that in anything that we do domestically to transform the economy, we try to make those policies as open as possible for others to share in the benefits. And this takes us back in a loop to the domestic content requirements that I think is a signal to some countries that as the US pursues this path, the benefits might be retained at home and not shared with others. That does not play well in a multilateral context as well, where we're trying to create incentives for everyone to take the right actions, but also to be able to benefit from the transformations that are necessary. Let me stop there. Thanks again.
Extremely rich comments, remarks. Thank you so much, Dr. Waxman. This has been very, I think, balanced assessment of the IRA and the EU perspective on it. I would like to give the opportunity to the other speakers to react, perhaps, to some of what you just said. If there are views, we of course have some questions from the audience, and we are conscious of the fact that the senator has to leave a little bit early. Perhaps we would start with you, Senator, if you have something.
Sure. I would just flag two quick things that are responsive to the previous conversation. One is that if you assess your carbon price at the wellhead, or at the mine mouth, or at the port of importation, you solve a lot of the detailed problems about who is accountable for what. And that's the way my carbon price works. The second thing is that we have 4 Bruegel type analytical groups supporting our analysis of carbon pricing so that we're not trapped by anybody's and we can see where there are disagreements and where there's convergence. And what they across the board show is that the carbon price does not have to be very high in the initial years, that if it goes up to market affecting levels in outer years, that's what industry is planning for. They're not going to be able to get their factories shifted over in 6 months. It's going to take 3 years, 6 years, whatever. So knowing that it's coming has been very significant. One of the things I learned from this process is how much dead space and dead weight is created on industry by raising the carbon price too soon, so that it's just dead weight cost on industry and does not give them a chance to react. You want it to be a powerful, forceful, global signal. But if all it is just a big load of economic weight that has no effect yet because they can't possibly retool in time, then you may be accomplishing other goals, but you're not accomplishing climate goals. So there's room for, I think, considerable, you don't have to hit the public in the face with a massive carbon price day one.
Thank you so much, Senator. I have a question from the audience where, that concerns the CBAM rollout in the EU, and that I think is very much on the minds of all of us in Europe in these troubled times, as we see sort of the energy prices going through the roof. Dr. Shaheen, does the energy crisis make the rollout of Fit for 55 of the ETS reform and the CBAM legislation more difficult? Are we expecting delays? What's your take?
I mean, if you are against this type of legislation, you will use all the arguments you can see and that are on the table to delay. But at the same time, if you see a decarbonized industry as the future to go forward with, less dependent on countries like Russia, then this could be a moment to accelerate. It depends really on how you look at things. So again, when it comes to ETS, this is not legislation that will start next year. Hopefully, and maybe I'm positive, is that we will have the energy crisis behind us. So when it comes to dealing with the short-term effects that we are seeing today, that's Repower EU. Mm-hmm. That's basically one of the pieces that we are working on. And by the way, I'm part of the team of SNV that took over the negotiations from my colleague Jette Guteland. We will have a vote on this next week, and there is, the plan of the Commission is to auction more allowances to maybe, on the one hand, have more revenues also to invest in decarbonization, have much better like connectivity improvements between countries, like cross-border projects to improve, I think, this energy security of the EU as a whole. And this is something we will look at in the short term. We will have probably more investments in LNG terminals to make sure that next winter we will also be much better prepared, or at least prepared. You've seen what happened yesterday with the sabotaging of Nord Stream. This is something that that affect, of course, every policy making that we're doing. But I mean, for CBAM and ETS, this is it will still take a couple of years, more than a couple of years before they come into effect. So we're still focused. I mean, I'm not saying that we are very far in the process, but I still think that, let's say on CBAM, by the end of the year, we can have an agreement with the council. At least that's our goal.
Thank you so much. Rebecca, Dr. Dell, you've heard Dr. Waxman, Jake speak about some of the irritants or some of the tensions, as well as the upsides of the IRA. Obviously, everyone here in the EU is very happy that this legislation came about in August. At the same time, there are some concerns and some tensions that are on people's minds, on minds of politicians and analysts here in the EU. How would you? Is there something you would like to respond to those concerns?
Yeah, so I appreciate Dr. Waxman's concerns, and particularly his point about the need to provide a model for lower income, emerging and developing economies, because I think that's an incredibly important point, both in terms of moral relations between nations, and also practically, that's where we expect to see the emissions growth in the years and decades to come. However, my perspective is that providing an effective policy model for lower income countries is less important than providing a model of actually succeeding in reducing your emissions. That the single most important responsibility that higher income countries have in the climate crisis is actually reducing our emissions. And so if the policies and approaches that are most suitable and will allow us to most effectively reduce our emissions in higher income countries are different than the policies and approaches in lower income countries, that's okay. And specifically in the most greenhouse gas intensive industries, the industries that are most affected by the trade policies, as I mentioned earlier, the technologies and production systems that will get us really close to zero emissions, get us where we need to go for achieving our Paris Agreement goals. Most of those are still pre-commercial. So the best thing that higher income countries can do for the rest of the world is get those systems and technologies actually up and running, because there's no reason to expect that lower income countries will pay for that commercialization cost. They neither should nor can. And so the set of policies that we need in higher income countries to get those systems working so that they can then be transferred and that technology can be shared, that's going to be quite different than countries that quite reasonably say, look, when you guys have the clean stuff figured out, let us know, and we would love to be on the receiving end of your technology transfer.
That sounds very generous, Rebecca. I would perhaps, and it's perhaps a nice sort of interlude towards the second part of the conversation that we wanted to have, and that is international rules on subsidies. Like we have, of course, the question of, like whether the US and EU should or have an interest in cooperating on working on a revised international subsidies set of rules, given the fact that we do, in fact, as you say, have positive externalities drawing from subsidies, but we also have trade effects, and sometimes those trade effects then bring those very much appreciated and appropriate subsidies into the crosshairs domestic statutes for countervailing duties and WTO dispute settlement as the rules stand right now. We do know that the US domestic statute on countervailing duties, for instance, is quasi-automatic. We had a recent episode on solar where essentially, the US domestic CVD statute almost shut down the US domestic solar industry because imports were not permitted or were going to be much higher priced, and causing an emergency declaration by the president. Are we in a situation where we need new rules domestically and internationally, or need to cooperate on new rules in order to diffuse those tensions and sweep those mines that are set by domestic and international law? Is maybe you would want to have a go at that first, Rebecca? Thank you.
Sure. I think it's a great question. And I think that particularly subsidies that are organized around and with the clear intention of supporting innovation and commercialization of necessary technologies and production systems, like those, it should be very easy for, at least conceptually, maybe not practically and politically, but conceptually, it should be very easy for us to agree that those types of subsidies are not restraints of trade and should not be subject to countervailing duties, and to, let's say, conflict on trade conflict more generally. I think the problems will arise in a couple of places. One with subsidies whose purposes are less clear. They're perhaps mixed. They perhaps apply to more mature technologies, but ones that maybe still need a little bit of help. Things like, I think, the hydrogen subsidies in the recent Inflation Reduction Act are a great example. There's a lot of hydrogen electrolyzers out there in the world already. But we think that there will be an enormous amount of progress in that technology if we can bring it to scale. So do those scale up incentives qualify as innovation? And so do they merit the exemption from trade conflict that you are talking about? I think exactly where we draw the line is going to be quite complicated. But, when is trade policy ever simple?
Indeed.
Have to jump off onto a call, but if I may, I'd like to make one sort of overarching point on the question of subsidies. I think the key point that needs to be decided in any discussion of subsidies is, will uncounted negative externalities count as a subsidy? If the only time you count a subsidy is when it's a specified tax credit, that creates one platform. If you start to count negative externalities from which the company is protected, from which the fuel is protected, that really opens up a much more robust, healthy, and I believe accurate subsidy discussion. And if you look at how the IMF quantified the $660 billion in subsidy that the fossil fuel industry gets in the United States, the bulk of that was uncounted negative externalities not baked into the price of the product. So if you walk away from considering that, you're walking away from the vast bulk of the price signal, and you're playing only in the margins of the subsidy debate. So I think it's really important that we nail down that as a common area of agreement by everybody participating in subsidy and carbon border adjustment discussions.
Thank you so much, Senator, and really appreciate that you took the time to be with us today. I very much wish you all the best for your efforts with domestic carbon price and CBAM legislation. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. And to the EU folks, show us no mercy. No waivers, no exemptions, no delays. Thank you.
I think Dr. Shaheen will love to hear that. That gives another bit of cloud to your negotiations, perhaps with the council that are proving to be very exciting, I'm sure. But if I can, Mohammed, Dr. Shaheen, can I get a viewpoint from you on, would you lend your political cloud to a process where we are agreeing on define categories of permissible green subsidies? We just heard from Dr. Dell that these things are, should be conceptually easy, but it doesn't really seem like it would be easy, the technical work that is necessary in order to tease out what is really, where the negative externalities are, where the positive externalities are.
Yeah.
How do we go about this? Which forum would be appropriate?
Let me first say that I really, really loved the last comment of Senator Whitehouse. I mean, a different approach of looking at, let's say, costs and subsidies, because this is quite factual. All these externalities are paid by us, by taxpayers, and they are not incorporated in the price. I mean, this is an interesting starting point. Well, if that's the starting point, I think we will look at differently to many subjects. I sometimes make this joke that we pay 3 times for the milk in the supermarket or in the EU. It's once when you buy it in the supermarket, the second time through the to the subsidies of the EU for agriculture, and the third time to basically pay for all the negative effects that are associated with some of the production. And these are not incorporated in the price. But anyway. When it comes to the WTO, it's not an invisible hand that takes decision without us being there. We set the rules together. And it's a bit of, again, we have to reassess what we need to have, what type of framework we need to have in order to enable, to accelerate maybe even these investments, instead of putting a brake on development. Because Dr. Dell has a point. We need to make sure that the curve towards a commercial applicability of these technologies, those costs should be paid for by some countries that are willing to do that. And of course, there's also a benefit at the end, because they can export technologies, they can sell technology. I mean, let's not act as if there's no benefit for the companies that invest in these type of innovation. But we have to acknowledge that if you look at the key technologies that we will be needing for decarbonization, without becoming too unrealistic, some people say nuclear fusion will be there. I really hope that, because it will be a disruption. But if it comes to CCS, if it comes to hydrogen, still a lot of innovation is needed. Still a lot of research investments are needed, both in process and in product innovation. But at the same time, we have to already start producing. It's a bit of a complicated puzzle. You're laying the pieces, and at the same time, the picture is changing. It's not that easy. So we have to have a little bit of flexibility there, and a little bit of trust, I think, as well. But at the end of the day, we together make the rules, and then we hold each other to those rules. But these rules need to be set again. Therefore, I've had quite some talks with people from the WTO, people from all kinds of countries, and they say at the end of the day, this is also a bit of like territory where we need to see. I mean, it's unprecedented when it comes to things like CBAM and the vast amount of investments in decarbonization. And the EU, we have the Innovation Fund that we maybe will rename into a climate investment fund or something like that. I mean, these investments are needed to accelerate decarbonization globally, not only in the member states of the EU. And this could create a lot of opportunities. And we need to make a fair set of rules where we check to what extent this state aid and to what extent does this help to decarbonize, but we have experts for that. But I do believe, for example, one of the comments that Dr. Dell said is that every country wants to have their own blast furnace or steel mill. Every country wants to have their own electrolyzer capacity. This will require, if we all focus on the current technologies, this will mean that it's almost impossible to do, because we don't have enough raw materials for these for the current technologies. So that those technologies need to be developed. We need to find substitutes for these raw materials. They need to be much more circular, etc., etc. And we need to, at the one side, give room for investments in current production, and those have to be fair. We have to check state aid, how commercial applicable is it, but we also need to have significant room to scale up and to find new materials to be used in this process of decarbonization.
Thank you so much. And you just spoke of experts. So speaking of experts, Jacob, if I may turn to you, we had, just in January, and speaking of state aid, just in January we had, the revised guidelines from the European Commission on state aid for environmental and energy purposes. For instance, providing for the permission or the framework where decarbonization of production processes and green technologies, the fund where the 100% of the funding gap could be permitted to be financed by public authorities. That brings about sort of a major change. It's unprecedented, and places like Bruegel will hopefully be in a good position to analyze the impact, environmental as well as economic there. But it also has an impact on how we meet our international obligations in regard of the subsidies and countervailing measures agreement, for instance. How do we reconcile, and how do we reconcile the tensions that brings about, perhaps speaking of just transition with third countries that do not have these resource endowments? There's a lot of challenges there. Would you have a view to share?
Well, thanks. I am not a WTO expert, let alone a WTO subsidies law expert, which is a specialization all in itself. But I mean, what I would say is that you're absolutely right that the EU is also making big bets on investment and innovation. That's not what's unique between our approach and the US approach. And there may be some cooperation to do to make sure that everyone perceives these kinds of investments as necessary, absolutely essential to the green transition, and something that the WTO rules should not interfere with. It's more the next stage of whether you then attach domestic content requirements to access to those benefits, which the EU has not taken, but the US has. And again, I'm not an expert in this area, but at least from a multilateral point of view, I would find it difficult to imagine the WTO coming to an agreement where that kind of a subsidy attached to that conditionality could be exempted from disputes of one kind or another. The idea that, in essence, the absence of regulation could also be considered a subsidy, an actionable subsidy or prohibited subsidy, I'm not sure which, under WTO law is a very interesting one. And that certainly would require a significant revolution in the way in which WTO rules are designed. But it's something, worth exploring. I think it's been explored at the academic level. It'd be interesting to see how far we can get on with it at the political level as well. I just wanted to make one final comment about this idea of what is a climate policy approach that's perceived as providing a fair opportunity, not just to developing countries, but frankly to European industry as well, which also wants to be able to benefit from these investments in creating markets for new low carbon technologies. If it's right that the US's discriminatory rules on access to markets in these areas and benefits in these areas is temporary, designed to drive innovation, but then would make the access to those markets and to those benefits more open at a later stage in the development of the policy, that would be good to hear. I think that would help in terms of the reaction to the policy, but haven't heard that yet. But I think it's really important to keep in mind that many countries don't just want a steel mill. They want the capacity to produce solar panels. They want the capacity to produce green hydrogen as well. And in order to make that possible, it's not just about transferring technology. It's also about allowing access to markets for that technology, particularly for those countries that have small domestic markets. And when we're dealing with countries, for example, in Africa, that are on the cusp of deciding whether they're going to exploit fossil fuels or whether they're going to try to leapfrog over that into things like green hydrogen production, they need assurances that those choices that they make will be able to find markets, not just at home, but internationally.
Rebecca, you're much more at the sort of pulse of what is happening in DC on trade policy, and particular with regard to market access, and which would, as we just heard, also ensure a somewhat just transition internationally. When can we expect perhaps a somewhat change of mind in Washington, DC towards the issue of market access, which, would really go hand in hand with issues of, of subsidization, technology transfer in an open economy? Is there any hope, or do we have to be patient?
I think that Senator Whitehouse's remarks, in which he emphasized that the United States has had extremely open markets for decades now, and has significantly suffered as a consequence of that, because of the manipulation of trade conditions and production conditions by other countries. I think those are very typical attitudes in Washington, D.C. I think you would hear something very, very similar from a very wide range of different places in the political landscape. And so I think that the current trend in Washington, D.C. is very much toward more cautious proceeding with greater caution than in the past around issues of market access. And I don't expect that will be, that trend will reverse for a number of years.
That seems to be indeed the zeitgeist in Washington.
Yes,
right now.
That is the direction the pendulum is swinging.
That, whether there's substance to it or not. May I perhaps, as we are talking about subsidies, one of the issues of subsidies and WTO rules, of course, Dr. Shaheen Mohammed, is the issue of export refunds. And export refunds, rebates, you must love this particular subject matter, because you receive lots of emails from industrial sources where they ask you to insert amendments that allow for export refunds of carbon-priced European products. I would perhaps ask you to give us a view on where we stand. These export refunds are currently seem to be WTO illegal, depending on their design. Can you perhaps give us a view, a perspective on what we have to expect on this particular issue in the trilogue, which is difficult? I know you're not an oracle, but perhaps you have a take.
I mean, to be honest, this is not something we already are starting to discuss. I think we will get there. Still, we have some other issues that we need to resolve. I mean, the message is quite clear, both in the Council and in the Parliament. There are voices that want to create also a level playing field for the export-depending industry. I've been talking to people at the WTO. It is applicable, I think, under the WTO rules, if you would do it if it's like a VAT type of measure. But again, we didn't specify at all how this will look like. And we will continue discussing also with the Commission to see what could be an approach that's acceptable, helps us decarbonize, and is not like greenwashing, all the greenwashing trade specifically, when it comes to the policies we already have for years, like the emission trading system. So what will be the result? It's a bit still, I mean, I have no idea. We still have to assess what is possible and how we can technically handle that. But the message, I think, is clear, and we are working towards a solution. I unfortunately, David, have to leave. I have another meeting that I need to go to. Thanks for having me, and of course, any interesting event, please reach out, and we'll see whether we can have a contribution. Thanks, everyone from Bruegel, and of course, my fellow panelists. It was inspiring to hear all your good inputs. I was writing down quite some stuff, so thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mohamed, and hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.
If I may, as we are nearing the end of the event, may I ask perhaps the remaining two to give your views? We asked the question of scoping the challenges on transatlantic climate and trade cooperation. What is your view? What would be the number one challenge that we need to address? What is the priority item, and where should it be resolved? You can fight for the first answer, but it's of course a somewhat a political priority setting here. I can equally read out some questions from the audience, but if you have an intuitive answer that would be that comes to mind, perhaps Jacob.
I mean, just speaking from my own perspective in DG Klima as opposed to DG Trade or other aspects of the Commission's work, where I would really like to move forward is in the theme that came out before around discussion around harmonization of standards, because I do think that is where there is a lot of potential now that the US is moving more aggressively in this space, and to both develop some common approaches that could be helpful in creating global markets, but also to avoid trade tensions. I think one of the panelists remarked that CBAM implementation can only be helped by a circumstance in which we have agreement, at the very least, on how it is that you measure carbon footprint from covered products. That's at least one area where we'd like to see some advances. So that would be top of my list.
Thanks so much. Rebecca, would you second that notion?
I think that is an extremely important prerequisite for most of the other policies that we would like to pursue. But I would like to again emphasize what I think is a really underappreciated point, that our ability to actually enforce those types of standards is, I think, far, far poorer than almost everybody in this space assumes. And so if members of the audience are interested, I commend to them the wealth of investigative reporting that has been done on counterfeit pharmaceuticals in international trade. Pharmaceuticals are probably the single most tightly controlled product that trades internationally for obvious reasons. They're pharmaceuticals. They have the opportunity to do a lot more harm to their customers than, someone whose steel might not come from the plant that it's purported to come from. And yet there's clear and ubiquitous evidence that international trade in pharmaceuticals, that there are huge amounts of counterfeit pharmaceuticals, that even when the drugs aren't technically counterfeit, they often do not come from the facilities that they are purported to come from. It's a poorly constrained system. Once you have a hot rolled coil of steel, it's very hard to tell where it was manufactured. And so one of the reasons why I think that a number of thinkers have become more interested in models like the kind of more muscular versions of carbon clubs is because this allows you to get around issues of trying to attribute a specific amount of CO2 emissions to a specific physical product that arrives at your border. Because in answer to your question, I think from the perspective of what do we actually need to get us on a pathway toward 1.5 in the most greenhouse gas intensive industries? I think a good answer to that question is very strong, very high value lead markets for zero or near zero emissions commodities. And so having, and that's precisely the kind of situation that well-intentioned but poorly enforced policies would undermine. And so I think that really needs to be, this issue of enforceability really needs to be top of mind.
That is a wonderful last comment, and we did manage at least and in the end to agree on the importance transatlantically to agree on the importance of product standards or carbon standards methodologies for accounting being sort of on the top of both lists. I would perhaps just advertise for an initiative at the very end started by Jean-Marie Pogam, the Deputy Director General at the WTO, who is now started to convene a group of seal makers, but also governmental and think tank representatives in the WTO to talk about the WTO's role in coherence of advancing standards, in particular in the steel sector, but also in other sectors. So the WTO will have a role to play. I would also take this opportunity at the very end to make a brief advertisement for a group of they call themselves trade experts who will talk tomorrow at the WTO Public Forum about the very same issue I noticed on that we talked about today. They will have a slightly different gender balance than or exact opposite gender balance that we had here today. So I would if there's well received competition out there that will happen tomorrow in Geneva, and we all look forward to seeing their ideas and their contributions to the subject of CBAM cooperation as well as subsidy cooperation transatlantically and internationally. I would like to thank you very, very much for attending this event, for being here as speakers. I thought we have had a wonderful exchange of views, of very different views, and it's great to scope the challenges that are out there. Certainly, I would, with that, I would like to say goodbye to our audience. Thank you again very much for being here, and hope to see you at our next Bruegel event. All the best and good luck. Thank you.
Thank you.